The Shaping Opinion podcast is brought to you by O'Brien Communications, an independent corporate communications firm. O'Brien Communications helps clients of all sizes with corporate communications and strategic planning, marketing communications, public relations and media relations, content development and writing, and crisis and issues management. Learn more at o'briencommunications.com. Jared, can you remember one October surprise that really caught you off guard?
Oh, man, can I? You know, the October surprise, I think, that really caught me off guard, or at least was sort of the classic October surprise, was the arrival of Hurricane Sandy on the closing days of October of 2012. Now, this is sort of a classic October surprise because when we normally think of that term, we think of one opponent springing another. Or one opponent springing a surprise on another, having a piece of opposition research ready to go, and trying to sort of get that in under the wire, as people are sort of formulating their final decisions before they go to the polls. The arrival of Hurricane Sandy is a classic October surprise in the sense that it was a total freak of nature, quite literally. It basically took swing states New Hampshire and Virginia off the campaign trail for a week or two and gave President Obama an opportunity to appear presidential. It also included the image of then popular Republican New Jersey Governor Chris Christie warmly greeting Obama, in the aftermath of the storm, which helped give him this additional aura of presidential power and this earned media of presidential imagery. It was really put Romney at a disadvantage. Now, whether that was actually a turning point is a matter of debate. I mean, Obama was already sort of resurgent in the polls at that point, but it certainly didn't hurt.
I'm Tim O'Brien. In this episode of the Shaping Opinion podcast, we're joined by Jared Keller. He's a writer and a senior editor at Task and Purpose. It's a news site that covers military and veterans issues. He's contributed articles to a wide range of media. The premise of our podcast is simple. We talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Today we're going to talk with Jared about one article he wrote in 2016 for the Smithsonian. The title was The Strange History of the October Surprise. Now that we're into the month of October during an election year, the subject of October surprises will inevitably come up. Campaigns save their best or worst for this time of the year, hoping that any surprise announcement can help their campaigns while hurting their opponents. In 2016, Jared Keller wrote an article for the Smithsonian.com that summarized some of the most notorious October surprises in our history. Jared, before we get too deep into our topic today, can you tell us a little bit about your own background and what brought you to write this story about October surprises?
Sure. Well, my journalistic history is sort of all over the place. I started out at the Atlantic magazine covering sort of everything and ended up covering business for Bloomberg Business Week and international affairs for Al Jazeera. And I'm currently the acting editor-in-chief of Task and Purpose, which is a military and veterans website. But politics has always been in my blood. I grew up in a household where my father was a political reporter in the CBS area, my father is a political reporter in the Boston area for the CBS affiliate there. And his emphasis or his political focus was always sort of on the idiosyncratic, those individual moments sort of divorced from any campaign that really changed the shape of an election. Those are the things that I think I personally find interesting. It was more that he would come home with these amusing stories of asking Lamar Alexander during the 1992, maybe it was the 1991. No, I believe it might have been the 1992 Democratic primary in New Hampshire, if he knew the current price of a carton of milk and a dozen eggs. And that sort of that one question nuked Lamar Alexander's campaign. He was caught on a hot mic afterwards asking, somebody get me the price of a gallon of milk and a dozen eggs. And now if you ask any presidential candidate, they always know that answer. But I remember him coming home and telling me that story, and that sort of got me fascinated on the little unpredictable idiosyncrasies of politics. And that's sort of been a theme through all of my work, especially when I look at big institutions, on those little confluences of structure and agency that come together into a perfect storm and the results they leave in their path.
That comment that you just made about your father asking that question that nuked the campaign, you reminded me of something when you said that. Katie Couric, when she interviewed Sarah Palin, she asked her what she reads, or I think it was something to the effect, what do you read? And Sarah Palin couldn't quite answer it right. And that one little interview moment was given a lot of credit for kind of submarining Sarah Palin's credibility during that campaign. What do you think about reporters? Do you think that when they ask a question of a candidate, naturally they're not necessarily supposed to be for or against a particular candidate, but would submarining a candidate with a question they weren't prepared for be a good thing for a reporter? Is that a feather in your cap if you are a reporter?
I think depending on where you work, I'd say in D.C. having a scalp on your belt probably helps. You gain a reputation for being a tough reporter, for being someone who people need to be on their guard, and you help to burnish your reputation as adversarial. Now, do I think that reporters intentionally go out of their way to nuke candidates? I think there are some who try. There are also some who allow candidates to hang themselves on their own rope. A great example in my mind is the late John McCain when he was running for office in, I believe this was back in 2008, was asked a question about Iran, and jokingly, I think he was speaking to a sort of more of an audience that would have been more acceptable, that would have been more amenable to this joke. But I think he went bomb, 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 Iran, and that I don't think was an intentional joke on his part. I think he was just nervous and just kind of fell back on something. These moments crop up all the time. And often I think most reporters want to give a politician space for unforced errors. Being able to answer what you read is really the easiest question. If anything, the answer is I've read so much, I can't really name a specific title. I try to keep my information consumption so high that all the things blend together. A non-answer in the form of an answer.
Well, that brings us actually to the subject today, and the subject for today is October surprises. And you wrote an article that was very interesting, and it went back deep in history. You went all the way back to the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson versus John Adams, and you described it as did you describe it as the dirtiest campaign in American history?
Well, you have to remember that historians look back on this election as a quote unquote nonviolent revolution. It was a total ideological realignment of the structure of American government and the sort of the refocusing of the administrative institutions of government without a shot being fired. And at this point, during at the tail end of a very violent 18th century, the fact that there's this sort of transition. Or that there's going to be this sort of transition, is really surprising. But in the run-up to it, the old line is from Clausewitz is that politics is just war by other means, and this is the closest you get to going to war in politics until I think the most recent election. There is some horrible slander. Insults being tossed back and forth, and these things are in a different media environment, so they take time to percolate. At one time, Alexander Hamilton, the real October broadside was Alexander Hamilton authoring this 54-page document assailing him, saying if we must have an enemy at the head of government, let it be one whom we can oppose, who will not involve our party in disgrace of his foolish and bad measures. And this is a 54-page screed from Alexander Hamilton, while it seems pretty tame, is pretty aggressive. As the historian Joseph Cummins says, it's really scandalized his contemporaries. And this is, by the way, in a race when a reporter who was actually a Jefferson surrogate, James Callender, spent months ridiculing Adams as, and I quote, a hideous hermaphroditical character. So, it's kind of telling that a 54 pages of just political screed was way more scandalous at the time than any sort of modern titillating scandal.
And as you mentioned, the big difference was how long it took for things to percolate. So they may have said something that was then reported today, and it would take time for it to go to press. Then it would take time for those newspapers to make it to people. And back then, especially back in those days, there was this, in the PR business, we call it, basically secondhand influence when a paper is passed around. Well, back then, newspapers were passed around. One newspaper may have been read by 10, 15, 20 people before it was thrown away, if not more.
One interesting element related to this is actually the Declaration of Independence. Because of, and I wrote a story on this for Pacific Standard magazine, but because of the nature of the printing presses, the actual first news of America being, or the United States of America declaring its independence was a single line at the very end of the I believe it was the evening edition of July 2nd, saying, "Oh, by the way, we're an independent country." And the earliest way that people learned was either through a German language paper, which managed to print faster. So the first full Declaration of Independence was published in German, but through broadsides which were sort of these classic one sheet pieces with just big headlines on them that were just passed around. And that was sort of the original. I mean, the news of the Declaration of Independence spread faster by word of mouth than it did by print, which was sort of indicative of how things traveled at the time.
You know what? There are so many October surprises we could talk about and that you've written about, but there is one that's from the 19th century that I did want to bring up before we get into the more current times, and that is because of the word fake news. I read the case study on this particular election, and all I could think of was the term fake news. Mm-hmm. But this was the 1880 James Garfield versus General Winfield Scott Hancock, the famous Union general, and they were running against each other in 1880. And I know that there was this newspaper called the New York Truth, ironically, mm-hmm. and it published a letter that was allegedly written by James Garfield voicing concerns over Chinese immigrants stealing jobs from American workers. Can you explain what that controversy was about?
Yeah. In this context, this is a time when you sort of have very similar anti-immigrant attitudes that we sort of see today. But Garfield allegedly wrote in this letter that the Chinese problem wasn't really a problem, and that there was absolutely nothing wrong with any, a true blue American business hiring labor, and I quote, where they can get it the cheapest. And this infuriated a lot of workers, especially, and keep in mind, this is in the decades that are leading up to some of the major, progressive and union movements in the U.S. So, things are getting, this is not great. This is not great for him. But so the problem is that those anxieties are extremely pronounced in California at the time. I should mention that during the 1850s and 1860s, the original vigilante groups of the United States formed in California out of anxiety over immigrants. In one case because they were bringing crime, in another case because there was worries over economic control. So it's a major concern, and the journalist who writes this fabricated correspondence is arrested for fraud. But the incident costs Garfield California, even though he ultimately got the presidency. It could have cost him everything had that sort of impact spread beyond California.
It was huge, and it was fake, and it was published, and people believed what they read. It sounds very familiar to people these days, and it obviously has long roots. One other situation from around 1912 was when Woodrow Wilson was faced off against Teddy Roosevelt. And in this case, the October surprise was a lot like that natural disaster you mentioned. It was not necessarily something of a campaign springing something on another campaign. What it was Teddy Roosevelt was shot in the middle of giving a stump speech. The bullet hit his prepared remarks, and luckily they were 50 pages long because he had them stuffed into his suit coat, and they may have saved his life. He was actually bleeding as he gave the speech, and in the middle of the speech, which he never stopped, he said, "I don't know whether you fully understand it or not, but I've just been shot." And then he said, "It takes more than that to kill a bull moose." Can you tell us about that particular scenario?
I mean, there is no better sort of gift in American politics than to survive an assassination attempt, which I know is quite macabre and morbid when it actually leaves my mouth, but it's sort of true. So, he was shot during a stump speech in Milwaukee by a guy named John Schrank. This is at a time when actually, this is post McKinley's assassination. So this is at a time when political assassination is actually on the up and up. So he's shot, and Roosevelt doesn't really bat an eye. He removes his prepared remarks, which are in his pocket, and he's dripping with blood, and he just carries on. Like it's no big deal. Now Wilson, as we know, goes on to win the presidency, But Roosevelt, it's referred to by Cummins, by that historian Justin Cummins, as one of the most dramatic moments in American politics. And, it only helped to solidify Roosevelt's reputation as along with being a Rough Rider, but just as a real, rugged, individualistic badass. And it helped really enshrine his place in American politics. And it's funny, too, because it's not one of those stories that we mostly associate with him, but it is the most Roosevelt story in the history of Roosevelt stories.
That was him, and that was the essence of Teddy Roosevelt.
Oh, yeah.
Now we get a little bit closer to our time, and this is in 1968, and this was maybe one of the most famous October surprises. And it was 1968 when Richard Nixon was faced off against Hubert Humphrey, and the Vietnam was raging. Democrat Lyndon Johnson was still the president, and Johnson had suspended bombing missions to Vietnam, and Nixon had run on the promise to end the war. Nixon sent an emissary to convince the South Vietnamese not to suspend hostilities. And that's interesting, too, because we often talk about these days about presidents doing things before they are actually in office. Well, here we had a case where candidate Nixon sent an emissary to convince the South Vietnamese, one of our ally in that area, not to suspend hostilities, and Nixon won that election. Can you explain more about that October surprise?
Yeah, I think the point that you made that we often worry about about politicians involving themselves in international affairs when they haven't been elected yet. And this is it's sort of ironic because this all sort of was par for the course, but this is sort of one of the earliest instances of incorporating outside foreign influence into an election. It takes the idea of the October surprise and it expands it beyond simply domestic affairs. So at this point, by the way, and it's worth noting that this is 50 years ago. This is one of the times where 50 years ago we have invited a foreign country's own internal politics into our political conversation. Clearly Vietnam is going to continue to be a major issue, and it's going to come up again in the election of 1972, which I believe I also noted in my story on October surprises. But this is the first real instance where where politicians are just using outside forces and outside agents who really shouldn't have any involvement in domestic American politics in their business.
And he did. Nixon did do that. And again, as you mentioned, in 1972, Richard Nixon was now the president. Yeah. And now he was running against George McGovern. And Secretary of State said something, and these are probably the most famous words ever said in an October surprise. Kissinger announced as Secretary of State for the United States that peace is at hand in Vietnam only 2 weeks before Election Day. So now you had a country that was so divided over the Vietnam War. All people wanted to hear, probably on both sides, was that peace was at hand. For the people that were pro-war, they wanted to hear that victory was at hand. And for people that just wanted out of there, peace is at hand was a good thing. So now you have Richard Nixon's Secretary of State announcing this, not Richard Nixon, and not necessarily his campaign manager, but his Secretary of State. The voters felt better, and Nixon won that election. Of course, he was expected to win, but how much of an impact do you think Kissinger's statement had on the election outcome?
I would estimate not much, personally. Historian Robert Dallek wrote of the 1968 instance of suspending bombing that probably made no difference anyway. So these two cases actually with Vietnam sort of accentuate how hard it is to really tell whether an October surprise really makes a difference or not. But it yields two things. One, again, as I said, we're inviting a foreign country into our domestic politics. And B, people are really blatantly trying to pull dirty tricks on each other in this late stage. The October surprise has been a natural part of American politics, but these guys are pushing the envelope for what it means and what it means to actually use the resources of government and of a political campaign to really try and stick it to your foe as hard as you can. So, in each one of these successive stages, we're sort of ratcheting up the intensity of each October surprise. It's no longer 54-page manifests, declaring that we should have a head of the party who's someone who we can actually get behind. No, it's liaising with the Vietnamese government and using, the geopolitical future of a country and those long-term consequences for the sake of swinging in a domestic election, which, as we've experienced with Afghanistan and Iraq, is certainly not a trend that's going away anytime soon.
No, it's hard to separate foreign affairs from any political discussion. And when you get into the October phase of any campaign, it's always those heightened concerns that really can influence an election or at least cause a lot of sensitivity. Another election later on, now 1992, this was George H.W. Bush facing Bill Clinton. And at this time, now, George H.W. Bush had been vice president of the United States under Ronald Reagan. So Ronald Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, was indicted for perjury and obstruction of justice during an investigation into Iran-Contra arms trading scandal. And Bush, being Reagan's vice president, could be tied to that. So now you have a scandal breaking under George Bush as president, and the Clinton campaign decided to take advantage of that. There was also another thing that I think the Clinton campaign really worked well, and it wasn't necessarily an October surprise, but George Bush made a promise. He used the term, "read my lips, no new taxes," and then he raised taxes.
Yeah.
So when he did that, the Clinton campaign really hit him over the head with that. So, but going back to that October surprise, could you explain more about the Iran-Contra affair?
Keep in mind that the night that we're talking 1992, and this is a very special circumstance because we're talking a three-way election, right? We've got the Ross Perot factor. But, one thing that is really telling about the 92 election is that while the Clinton campaign seized on it, the move by the Bush campaign to defend themselves actually sort of had something like a Streisand effect, where what they did was instead of saying that it was a plot by Democrats, they accused the independent counsel, Lawrence Wash, who was a registered Republican, by the way, of using the indictment to screw over George H.W. So it sort of made them look petty. And again, I don't believe that this really was the make or break, considering the impact that the no new taxes gaffe had on the campaign. But it's worth noting that for Bush, there was no hard feelings. I mean, it was clearly that they don't think that I'm pretty sure they don't believe that the Weinberger indictment did them in. I mean, especially because Bush pardoned Weinberger in the twilight days of his presidency, sort of as thanks for everything, you're free to go. So it's, the 92 instance is really convoluted, but it was a nice example of how a sudden legal action could quickly, or something that, normally would have been sort of legally minute or sort of irrelevant to the campaign, could be weaponized in the closing days of the campaign as quickly as humanly possible. And again, it is an example of ratcheting up these October. Basically, everyone is looking for an October surprise. Now everyone has these machines designed to spring Oppo research or any sort of Oppo campaign on someone at the last possible second.
In fact, the public even starts to expect the October surprise now. It's already in the mainstream. In 2000, George W. Bush was facing Al Gore. And there was an October surprise in that election, too, before the voting and before all the controversy over the voting. This October surprise was when actually Fox News reported days before the election that George Bush was arrested for drunk driving in 1976 after a night of partying. Bush came clean in a press conference. He admitted everything, and he said he learned his lesson. So there was a case where you had the October surprise, and you also had the candidate come out and try to do some real aggressive damage control. What would you say about George Bush's response in that case?
I actually would argue that he learned the lessons that his father's campaign didn't learn back in 92. Their reaction was to come out really aggressive, and Bush came out and just took it on the chin. And let's keep in mind that, and a lot of people I think forget this because of how foreign affairs took over sort of the American political conversation after 9/11, but Bush was not elected to be a foreign policy president. He was elected to be a caretaker president, to sit and oversee, the 8 years of economic growth under the Clinton administration, and to restore moral authority to the White House that had been sort of marked by the Clinton campaign. During this time, Gore has spent significant amount of time trying to distance himself, from Clinton. So for Bush to come out and say, yeah, I drove drunk and it was really stupid, and And, I learned my lesson, and, he had been sober for a long period of time before then. If anything, made him look even better. It helped burnish his credentials as a sort of moral and ethical leader who could restore some level of honor to the White House.
So here's the irony. At the end of George Bush's term, George Bush, as you mentioned, he was supposed to be a caretaker of the economy for his 8 years. So now we have Barack Obama. He's facing John McCain, and we're in the final days of the 2008 election. And the irony is, George Bush is faced with a major economic problem. And it's so bad because of the banking scandals and all the banking uncertainty and all the crisis that was affecting the housing market. Mm-hmm. I remember John McCain actually suspended campaigning for a few days, and that really worked for Barack Obama in the final days of the campaign. Can you describe what was going on in that case?
So the thing that really bothered people about this McCain situation is that McCain, this is, I believe, at the end of September, beginning of October, announced that he was going to suspend campaigning in the closing days because, and I quote, the historic crisis in our financial system. So the ironic thing is that he had conversations with John McCain, or John McCain had conversations with Barack Obama about suspending a debate and issuing a statement of broad economic principles and how to fix the economy. And basically, it was no time for partisan division, and whoever was going to be in charge was going to have to deal with this crisis. But he was pulling out of a debate. It was a debate in Mississippi. And it basically made him look like he was bailing during a time when he needed to be up there. And the Obama administration, or not the Obama administration, the Obama campaign issued a statement basically saying, here's the direct quote, "It's my belief that this is exactly the time the American people need to hear from the person who in approximately 40 days will be responsible for dealing with this mess." Now, this is Obama basically saying that, not in polite terms, that McCain is gonna suspend campaigning and then basically cut and run. It's going to be part of the president's job to deal with more than one thing at once. It basically made McCain look like he was ill-equipped to deal with economic issues. And considering that McCain had run on a really heavy foreign policy platform, it didn't help.
It definitely didn't help, and it definitely worked out for Barack Obama. It was one of those classic case studies where actually Barack Obama turned it on McCain, and it was a classic use of an October surprise, but he was actually taking what was given to him. John McCain made a decision. Maybe John McCain felt that he was deceived a little bit by Barack Obama's campaign, but this is politics, and John McCain's a veteran, so he probably felt that he had no one else to blame but himself after making that kind of mistake. There was one other October surprise that really wasn't October. I'd give this an honorable mention, and it was 1980. It wasn't an October surprise, actually, because the surprise came on Inauguration Day when the election was over. Actually, at that time, it was Ronald Reagan. He was facing Jimmy Carter. We had the Iranian hostage crisis that plagued Jimmy Carter, and it just seemed that Jimmy Carter couldn't get us out of that. But on Ronald Reagan's first day in office, the Iranians released the hostages. Can you explain what happened in that case and why that might qualify under October surprises?
So, the Iranian hostage crisis was a huge albatross around the neck of the Carter administration. And it was even more so of a problem after Operation Eagle Claw, which was that failed rescue attempt where the helicopters went down in the desert before they even kind of reached the airspace of Tehran. The irony of that incident of Operation Eagle Claw that actually led to the development of U.S. Special Operations Command. So, there's sort of a silver lining there. But, the image of NBC correspondent John Palmer on the lawn of the White House breaking the news of the failed rescue mission was a real black eye for Carter. And after those hostages were released on Inauguration Day, there was a belief that the Iranians had held on to those hostages deliberately for the point to just screw with Carter. That they just wanted to undermine. They wanted to undermine the Carter administration as much as possible. And there was a former Ford and Carter National Security Advisor, Gary Sick, who claimed in 1992 that individuals associated with the Reagan and Bush campaign of 1980 met secretly with Iranian officials in order to delay the release of hostages, basically promising Tehran a cache of Israeli weapons. The former Iranian president at the time denied, repeated the allegations. Congress refused to conduct an inquiry, and that's where the conspiracy theory comes from. There's no real hard evidence based on, there's interviews and lots of interviews, but it's one of those instances where the real October surprise is doing nothing or withholding something, as the conspiracy theory suggests.
When we talk about October surprises, the term we almost always hear is conspiracy theory. There's always a conspiracy theory when there's an October surprise. So I have one final question for you, and this is related to the future of October surprises, or maybe the current trend. Have you seen a change in the way the October surprise has unfolded? Are politics getting so sophisticated that they have the October surprise down, or is there a shift in the way October surprises are deployed these days?
It's hard to tell. In this past October, my impression was that there were so many bits of news breaking in such a period of time in October that the idea of the October surprise was just sort of irrelevant, especially with the accelerated rate of the news cycle. Now, things are even more chaotic. A friend of mine, I forget exactly who it was, but a friend of mine joked on Twitter. Oh, you know who it was? It was Matt Ford at the New Republic made a joke on Twitter where he said, I feel as though this news cycle is just like that episode of Battlestar Galactica where the Cylons attack every 30 minutes. It's just completely insane. So I think the idea of the October surprise is a little bit outmoded. It doesn't really apply to our current news cycle unless someone finds a way to drop, a real, the real political equivalent of a nuke come this October. And, God, I can't even imagine what that would look like.
Jared Keller, thank you for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.
Make sure to check out our show notes for more information on everything that we talked about today. You'll find a bio on our guest, Jared Keller, and you'll find more information on October surprises in American history. You can also listen to other episodes. We want to know what you think. On Twitter, just tweet to us at Shaping Opinion, or you could get in touch with us through our website, shapingopinion.com. You can subscribe to the Shaping Opinion podcast in many ways, and they're all free and easy to find on your favorite podcast channel. This is where we talk about people, events, and things that have shaped the way we think. Until next time, I'm Tim O'Brien.